not exaggerating on this topic. Marjorie Phillips came to us in Augusta, I think a long time ago, 7 years, but a long time ago. I had a chance, she walked in my office and said, I'm looking for a job. So I checked her references. One of them was a friend of mine down in Florida, who happened to be the president of Florida Society of Assistant Pharmacists at the time. He said, yeah, if I were you, I would hire her. She's the best hospital pharmacist in the state of Florida. I said, that ain't good enough for me. And so she's been with us ever since. So, we met a long time ago at the Southeastern Residency Conference, many years ago, and knew Marjorie back then. She's worked with the FDA, USP, is our PGY1 residency director, is currently on the Commission on Credentialing, the group that accredits residency programs. And again, she's recognized nationwide as an expert on investigational drugs and clinical research. So it's my pleasure to introduce you. Oh, I forgot to say that she's a Florida grad. Against her. Did a residency down at University of Florida, Shands in Gainesville. And then came to us, actually you worked for a year or so after that. I worked for about 5 years and then came to us. So I think that's right in our history. She's a clinical professor, one of those folks that made the promotion track all the way up, all working full-time at the hospital. That's pretty impressive. So, okay, that's enough. I'll turn it over to Marty.
Thank you, Dr. May. It is a pleasure to be here. And I can't see the other campuses too well. You're really small. Since this is my first time lecturing to those of you that aren't in the residency elective, I wanted to say hello and tell you a little bit about my teaching style. I provided you a lot of resources. So I always like to tell you what you need to know, what you're going to learn and need to know, give you a lot of resources, give you the slides, give you some supplemental research material if you want to read more, but also let you know what you're going to be tested on and give you enough notes that you can sit back and not have to take down definitions. So you have a 2-page handout that should be in ELC. And that can be used as an outline for those of you that are note takers. I always find writing something down helps rather than just looking. So this outline will give you list the learning objectives for you, as well as some of the definitions and an outline of the information I think is most important. The other thing to tell you, because I don't remember if Dr. May had mentioned it previously, is that you have a take-home assignment for today. Has everybody already seen and accessed that in ELC? So it is a 1-page take-home assignment, open book, worth 10 points on your next exam, so it could be the easiest 10 points you ever get. But it needs to be emailed to me with the right information, investigational drug homework in the subject line, because it's all going to go into an email folder, and then I will check you off after class on Thursday and provide your pass-fail grade to Dr. May. So if you do not email it to me with a timestamp before 11 a.m. on Thursday, you get 0. And it does say at least attempt each answer to each question. So I've had people that do this, that leave a whole section blank. That's also not going to get you credit. So again, it's only the easiest 10 points if you take the time to do it. Please print out and bring a hard copy with you to class, or bring it electronically to class as well. Because my other part is to try and be as interactive as I can be, knowing that I have students that are on 4 campuses and I can't see a lot of you. So I will be, in order to be equal opportunity and not just calling the folks here in Augusta, I will bring the photos of the class roll, and I will randomly pick people and ask you to chime in and comment. So. And one of the things that I think really important, because this is a drug information class, is to really focus on the things that you need to know from a drug information perspective, and things that will help you out in practice in the real world. So that said, I can barely see all of you guys, but instead of show of hands, if you wouldn't mind standing up for me, if you have been involved or seen a research or investigational drug at a pharmacy where you worked or a pharmacy where you observed. You can stand up. So a lot of the students here in Augusta did IPPE, and I can see some investigational drugs, so they're standing. And I can see a couple people standing on the other campuses, but not very many. Okay, you can sit down. Whoops, come on. Didn't mean it to be turned off. Anybody been involved in investigational drug preparation and or dispensing? Stand up if you have. You didn't
I
get
was
to
going to
check
say,
it?
I'm not sure if that
You're not
counts,
sure?
but yeah.
Okay. All right, so we got one here. Have you had an experience in a pharmacy where you worked a patient asked questions about an investigational matter or research study? I don't see anybody standing here, but that's something that's going to happen in real world practice. Patient admitted to the hospital on a study prescription, study drug. Dr. May said, I stayed and worked at Shannon for a year after residency. Then I spent 5 years at a community hospital. And when I came from a big academic medical center to a 200-bed community hospital, I said, do you ever do anything with investigational drugs? No, we don't do anything with research here. Guess what? A week later, we had a patient come into the hospital on an investigational drug. So it's the kind of thing that can happen anywhere. You don't have to be in an academic center. Okay? How many of you stand if you've had no experience at all with an investigational drug? Stand. All right. Thank you very much. I don't like ELC because I can never get it to work, but this way I at least feel everybody moved around a little bit. So here are the learning objectives for a combination of today and Thursday. By the time you finish these 2 classes, you should be able to define an investigational drug, describe the roles and responsibility of an IRB or institutional review board, determine when informed consent is required for participation in a clinical trial or for getting a study medication, and to be able to describe or explain the process for obtaining an investigational drug. And because this is a drug information class, to be able to identify the appropriate drug information sources, to be able to respond to questions from your patients about studies and study drugs. So these are real things that actually have happened to me or to another pharmacist I work for, and then they end up calling me. Hospital admission, and there's an order, patient may take own supply of XL147, 600 milligrams a day. GYN oncology, take LYC 55716, 3 capsules twice a day. Can you help me? I get a call from a physician or a resident. Get clofazimine for resistant mycobacterium, find dicrobotide for veno-occlusive disease. That's on the market now, it wasn't at this time. Can you get sanguinate for an anemic patient who's refusing drug due to their religious beliefs? We've got a hospitalized patient who insists on continuing this drug and is just known by a number. Is that okay? They're a psych patient and they're going to leave AMA if they can't take their drug. They want it. How can I start temizostat for a child with a tumor post-surgery? Guess what? It's investigational only and we can't get it for you. So these things happen all the time in practice when you're part of patient care. Even if you're out in a community setting, you're very accessible, you're going to be a respected professional, and I get these questions all the time from patients and consumers. My doctor wants me to be in a drug study. What can you think about it? So I want you to be in a position to be that expert, to be able to talk to them, answer their questions, know where to look if you don't have the information. And the basics to start with is knowing what an investigational drug is. Okay? So an investigational drug is an agent being considered for commercial marketing, not yet approved by the FDA. That's pretty black and white, pretty straightforward, pretty easy. It's on the market or not. That's the easy part of the definition. This is a little bit more complicated. True? Yes, true. But it's not the whole picture. I keep turning the thing off. Okay. So it's actually yes, but. So an investigational drug is not only that agent being considered for marketing that's not yet commercially available, but it is also an approved medication being studied for an unlabeled use for an unlabeled population. Okay, and we're going to compare and contrast that to as opposed to unlabeled use in clinical practice. And that's something that comes up all the time. Is it investigation or not? Can I dispense this or not? What are the circumstances? And I think a lot of the resources that you have this semester will help you with those questions. The other thing that's also kind of subtle is what is a drug? So a drug is an agent used for a therapeutic or diagnostic purpose. And that includes prophylaxis or prevention. This is where it gets really interesting if you've got something that you might consider a supplement that could be bought at a health food store, whether it's St. John's wort or melatonin. it's not going to be approved by the FDA, right, because it's a supplement. It's not an approved medication being studied, but it is a drug. So it is a drug if it's being used for sleep or depression. So it becomes a medication and thus becomes an investigational drug if it's being studied for a therapeutic or diagnostic or preventative purpose. And that can be really subtle, and you've probably seen some of the things in the literature and some FDA warnings about structure and function claims. So you can make general claims as a dietary supplement, of it being a supplement, but you can't make any health claims because that makes it a drug, and particularly an unlicensed drug or a drug that can only be used investigationally. Okay, so what's different about investigational medication? This should be reviewed for you, but I did include all the steps of the drug research process. And it starts with those preclinical trials, everything that occurs before human studies, both in vitro, in vivo, the ADME, or absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. All the information that's needed before it's determined that it's safe enough to proceed with human trials. Before any research can be done in humans, an investigational new drug or IND application is filed. And you probably learned in law that an IND goes into effect 30 days after they're received by the FDA, unless the sponsor is notified of a clinical hold, or there's a more rapid FDA notice. And the sponsor can't ship the drug to investigators until that IND effective date. But what does all that really mean in practice? I will give you the example. We have 2 researchers that are physicians in our emergency department that are doing research, different studies with ketamine in kids for indications that are unlabeled indications. So they actually had to apply to the FDA for use for ketamine for status asthmaticus, ketamine for acute sickle cell pain that's resistant to analgesics. And they had to submit an IND application. So even though it was on the market, in the context of that clinical trial that they were proposing, ketamine was considered an investigational drug. Again, because it's an unlabeled use or an unlabeled population. And guess what? 70% of the things we do in pediatrics are not labeled for pediatrics. So there's going to be a lot that's unlabeled if it's pediatric population. Or it may be a drug on the market for a new indication. And a lot of times with things that are done by an individual investigator, not by a drug company, if the drug is on the market, the FDA can come back and say it's exempt from the IND regulations under certain circumstances. And I won't go into all those details, but they're not going to do that if the use is potentially more risky or different from the use that it's on the market for. Higher doses, a different population that might be more vulnerable, for example. And I will tell you, in both of those cases with ketamine in pediatric patients, the FDA put a clinical hold on it and did not just send an approval letter, or did not just let those 30 days lapse. But it is possible that if an investigator wants to submit an application, they will get an acknowledgement with an IND number, and if they don't hear from the FDA within 30 days, they can start the study, or ship the drug in case there's more than one investigator and they're actually sending the drug out for shipment. So the same thing happens with pharma studies, with clinical trials. There is usually a lot of consultation with the FDA in the process with a new IND, with a new drug. But perhaps when it's a new indication and it's something that's old hat, it might be more of a formality. And this is the FDA 1571 IND application. So it's something you can go up and look at all the different sections. It's got the name of the sponsor and all the information about the specifics. And that section 11 on there with all the check marks is all the different information and attachments and different parts of the document and the application that go with that cover sheet, the 1571. So that IND application has that cover sheet or the Form 1571, an introductory statement, a general investigational plan, an investigator's brochure, a study protocol or protocols. So you can have an IND or an investigational drug investigation plan and have several different or a whole series of protocols that are designed to research that drug in a clinical way. Also, there needs to be information on the investigator or investigators and facility data on all the sites that will be used for the trial. So if it's a single site, single investigator, there will only be one Form 1572 signed by that principal investigator or PI. If it's a multi-site clinical trial, there will be a Form 1572 for every site in that multi-site trial. So a lot of the trials that you've read about with 30 sites or 100 sites, there will be a separate Form 1572 for each. So the purpose of the IND application to the FDA is designed to both ensure the safety and the rights of the human participants that are going to be in those trials and the scientific quality of the research that's being done. So if the FDA has any concerns that the study's not designed in an appropriate way, both for safety and for the scientific outcomes and the endpoints that they're looking at, to get information that will be meaningful to support an eventual new drug application, there'll be a lot of consultation back and forth with the FDA. So it may be focused on safety, it may be focused on the trial design for outcome purposes. Here's what the FDA Form 1572 looks like. It's called the Statement of the Investigator. So again, for each investigator, each principal investigator, the lead investigator at each site, the name and the address of the investigator, the information on them, so the curriculum vitae or other statement of their qualifications, the name and the address of where the facility where the investigations will be conducted, the laboratory, the IRB, and so on. And this document is where, if the pharmacy is involved, we actually put drug will be stored and dispensed from in our pharmacy address and room number. Here's the rest of the 1572, because this statement of the investigator is actually a contract between the FDA and the individual principal investigator on their commitments to conduct the study in a way that is ethical and safe. So I agree to conduct the studies in accordance with the relevant protocols, only to make changes in the protocol after notifying the sponsor, except when necessary to protect the rights, welfare of subjects, to personally conduct or supervise the described investigations, to inform any patients or any persons used as controls that the drugs are used for investigational purposes, and meet all requirements regarding informed consent. This also obligates the investigator to report any adverse experiences in accordance with the investigation. And that all associates, colleagues, and employees are informed of their obligations in meeting these. So by extension, anyone that's involved in the investigation reports to the principal investigator, and they're all bound by this agreement to maintain adequate and accurate records, to ensure that the IRB complies with all the requirements and the IRB provides oversight. So this all has to be signed and turned in. The investigator's brochure is a document that's involved, that's prepared in order to meet the sponsor's obligations to inform the investigator, so the principal investigator and any other investigators involved with the study, of the drug information, of the information that's needed about the product itself. This includes a brief description of the substance, the formulation, the structural formula if known, how it needs to be stored, pharmacological and toxicological effects, pharmacokinetics, summary of safety and effectiveness information from prior clinical studies, prior risks and side effects, possible risks and side effects, precautions, special monitoring. The weight of this or the size of this investigator's brochure depends on what stage this drug is in its investigation. So for a very new drug that's just being studied in humans for the first time, this information will all be based on animal data. And then anything that's known in humans, so the investigator's brochure will grow in size and depth as the product gets closer to market. Just to give you an idea, this is a pharmacy brochure or a pharmacy notebook for a clinical trial that's being done. And this drug still has a alphanumeric code, so it's not that far along. And here's the investigator's brochure. So it's pretty weighty. That investigator's brochure and the protocol and all the information here is bound by the confidentiality agreement that the principal investigator and the university signed with the sponsor. So that's why all the information I'm going to be giving you is either things that are publicly available or examples from drugs that are already on the market. But that's a really great information source, and it's going to be my primary information source for anything that I need but it's not an information source that you're going to be able to access, and it's not something I can share with you if you have a clinical conference to do, for example. So the drug research process, again, this should look mostly familiar. Phase 0, which is sort of a new term, phase 1, 2, and 3. How many of you have heard of phase 0 before? Anybody? I had not until a clinical trial we did about 4 years ago. So phase 0 is a proof of concept study, and it's done with very, very low doses in 1 or 2 individuals, just as a proof of concept to determine that it is safe and the concept works to allow a phase 1 study to proceed. So, so we actually did a phase 0 study in a clinical trial of an anti-cancer drug that there had been significant toxicities with an earlier product, and they did a new formulation that was supposed to be safer. But again, it was done for a single dose with a much smaller dose, just to look and see if the first pass mechanism and the kinetics was what was predicted, and it was safe enough to proceed with a clinical trial in phase 1. Phase 1 is typically that initial human exposure, 20 to 80 participants. For cancer studies, it could be a 3+3 approach where you do 3, and if 3 at a low dose is okay, you do another 3 at a little bit higher dose and another 3. If you have some toxicity with the first 3, you may do 3+3 or 6 with that first lower dose before you proceed. So the numbers could be even lower than that 20 to 80 if there's concerns about safety. Phase 2, do the efficacy and safety studies, usually several hundred patients. Phase 3, the longer-term safety effectiveness, looking at the most desirable dosing. A lot of times nowadays, the sponsors will add pharmacokinetics, do quality of life, and the other things, because they're already looking ahead towards market positioning and what they could do for comparative effectiveness and helping to justify the prices of their new products. So these involve a larger number of patients. They're designed to assess the overall risk-benefit and also to validate information that's proposed to be used for the labeling. So it's the phase 2-3 studies that are then submitted to the FDA as part of the new drug application. So all this data gets submitted to the FDA, but actually all that information from the 0, 1, 2, and earlier phase 3 studies are also going to be summarized in the investigator's brochure, and the sponsor is also responsible for, every time they update that investigator's brochure, providing updated copies not only to the investigators they're working with, but also to the FDA. Then comes the NDA, or new drug application. Because new drugs don't get approved overnight. You're really lucky if you get a fast track one approved in 18 months. The sponsor will typically continue doing additional phase 3 studies, which might be longer term studies, while the new drug application is being considered. And you probably have seen in the news and reviewed in class some back and forth with the FDA where they've had questions or directed additional trials to be done. So the sponsors very often will begin getting longer term safety information or continuing the patients that were in the phase 3 trials for a longer time in an open label extension in order to gather that additional information to support their application. After marketing approval, there will be phase 4 studies. Sometimes those phase 4 studies are actually a condition of marketing approval where the FDA will say, well, you need to do some longer-term safety information and provide updates to us later. Or it may be, outcome studies or comparative effectiveness to help position the drug on the market. And then additional phase 3 studies for new indications or new populations. So, and you've probably already seen that antibiotic studies will typically get approved for one type of infection, and then they'll go back and do additional phase 3 studies. So they may do community-acquired pneumonia or skin or soft tissue first, and once they get that approved, then they'll be working on neuroabdominal infection or hospital-acquired pneumonia or some other maybe more complex things. Knowing that once it's on the market, guess what? Any prescriber can use it for anything they want to within reason, right? So that first approval is going to be the most important. But those additional phase 3 studies are needed for new indications or new populations. And you're probably also aware that there's additional incentives, for example, to go back and get a pediatric indication, that it will extend the market exclusivity for a product. So we don't see as much of it as we'd like, but then we're often doing pediatric studies to get a pediatric indication for a drug that's already on the market before we promote it. More information about this in Thursday's class, where we're going to focus on requirements. But investigational drug use is governed by federal law, the FDA regulations, which is 21 Code of Federal Regulations, state law, Pharmacy Practice Act, Medical Practice Act, hospital regulations, and so on. And when study sponsors come to you or come in to inspect, they're focusing on what the FDA is wanting them to do. They're not thinking about state law. But we, as pharmacists and pharmacies and hospitals, are also bound by state law as well. And so are the physicians for medical practice and dentists and veterinarians, for example. Institutional policies and procedures also govern and can't be more lax than what federal and state laws say. And then accreditation standards, with the most popular being the Joint Commission, also have things to say about investigational drugs. I'm going to shift gears a little bit today and talk a little bit about the Institutional Review Board and give you an overview of that. Dr. May didn't mention, but I'm also an IRB chair, one of 2 for biomedical IRBs here at the university. So if you have any questions about that, or if you have a protocol that you're going to be submitting to our IRB, I'm certainly a resource for you. Anybody had any interactions already with an IRB for? I know somebody's had a couple people have had protocols, right, that have gone through the IRB or have been determined not human subject research and had IRB approval waived for that reason. So FDA's focus is dual in that it's protection of research subjects, but also scientific integrity. The IRB is the Institutional Review Board, so on a level of the local institution or the local area, responsible for protection of human subjects or human participants in research. And you notice I particularly said human subjects and not study patients, because human subjects could also be normal volunteers. And you probably remember that many phase 1 studies are done in normal volunteers. We also do a lot of phase 4 studies here. We have the Georgia Prevention Institute right on Walton Way and 15th Street, and they do studies with hundreds of normal volunteers that involve diet, exercise, and blinded medications provided by our pharmacy in most cases. So IRB, human subject protection focus, the federal regulations, the FDA regs say it must have a minimum of 5 members. You need to have diversity. What does diversity mean? Diversity means you can't have all men, you can't have all women. You need to have ethnic diversity. You need to have at least one non-scientist. They can't all be scientific members. And there needs to be one member of the IRB, at least one member of the IRB that provides the community sensibilities and is not associated with the institution that's sponsoring the IRB. Interestingly, I got a call a few years back from a pharmacy director at a smaller hospital outside of Atlanta. He was the P&T chair and also the IRB chair. And they had 2 or 3 studies that they did in the hospital. A couple of their ER physicians were doing research, and they had 1 inpatient study. So their P&T committee did double duty as the IRB for that institution because it was a small hospital. And they just had to bring in a community member that wasn't a scientist to be part and be a completely constituted IRB for purposes of meeting the FDA regulations. So when is IRB oversight required? And this is really important too. You don't want to do a study and then get in trouble for not having your IRB approval, because it's not something you can get after the fact. So the regulations say all investigational agents and devices in FDA-regulated trials need to have IRB oversight. So and the meaning of FDA-regulated can be different depending on the way you look at it. So so the sponsors obviously say, well, if I want to submit data to get my drug approved or to get my device approved or to get a new indication, that's obviously going to be FDA regulated. But if it's any product that is either commercially available and it's under FDA regulations, or should be or could be commercially available, it also is considered as FDA regulated. So it's also required by the biomedical public. So if you are going to present at a scientific meeting or a healthcare-related meeting, you're going to have to provide some kind of documentation or assurance that your research has been approved by an IRB and under IRB oversight, or for some reason that it's not required. Same thing happens for publishing. So most, all reputable pharmacy journals, so most pharmacy journals worldwide are going to want to know and even include in your manuscript that you had IRB approval before you started the research. So those requirements will catch you. And I can tell you a case a few years back of a physician that was doing something sort of innovative and neat, and that was totally out of the bounds of how medication would regularly be used, and decided to do it in a series of patients. And it was working great. And then submitted to present at a meeting, and they said, "Where's your IRB approval?" So then he submitted an IRB application. Guess what he was told? Can't get IRB approval after the fact, and because you're a faculty member, you're going to get sanctioned for doing research without approval. So none of that data can be used. So that physician doing something cool and innovative for an individual patient is allowed as under his individual prescriptive authority, and that's treatment. So which is different from research. As soon as he started collecting data and had that intent, even if you don't collect the data, but, well, I'm going to do this to a bunch of patients and I'm going to collect the data later, you're doing it with the intent that you're doing research, and it becomes research at that point. So that gets back to the case of an unlabeled use of an approved drug. This is something that will come up in your practice no matter where you are. And you need to be able to ask the question, is it investigational or not? Is it IRB approval required or not? And this is something that you already do as a pharmacist with your license, even if it's not investigational, if somebody tries to do something off-label, right? So, and I'm sure that Dr. May's already covered this in class, right? Off-label use of drugs. And so what would your resources be to determine if an off-label use was acceptable? Anybody can buzz in and tell me any of the campuses. What resources would you go to? What would your drug information resources be? If you got a prescription or you got a inpatient order and it was a totally different indication from what was in the FDA labeling, how would you decide whether that was something you would feel comfortable filling or not?
Like Lexicon?
Okay, Lexicon would be a good basic tertiary drug information. And that's actually a good one because it's backed up by AHFS drug information. So a lot of people don't, well, you know the PDR is not a good reference, right? Because what's in the PDR? PDR is the package insert. Most of the stuff we do is not in the package insert, right? So Lexicon is actually backed up by AHFS drug information put out by ASHP, and it is one of 3 compendial sources that are recognized by the Congress as indicating standard of care. Any other ones you think of?
You could look up on PubMed and see if there was any, either like a small trial or some kind of primary literature that would support the safety and efficacy of that drug in that population.
Great. So that's where you'd be using your clinical judgment to say, well, it's not common, may not be well accepted, but is it reasonable? And you have to remember that any prescriber under their license can use any drug on the market, unless it's in a REMS or a restricted distribution system, they can use it for anything they want, right? Just because they can do anything they want with their license doesn't mean that you should do, you should fill it, right? So you can certainly look at PubMed. That's going to take a lot longer, and then you're going to have to use a lot of judgment about whether that one case report or one case series is really enough evidence to say it's meaningful to do. So PubMed doesn't have that compendial weight, and PubMed oftentimes will not be enough to for an insurance company to agree to pay for it as well, which certainly might be a consideration for the patient in the facility where it's being done. Micromedics is now accepted by insurance companies and by Congress and considered potentially compendial. I do have some problems with micromedics, because micromedics sometimes will cite in there some very small case series or a couple of case reports. So I would be very careful about using micromedics as the Bible for whether it's appropriate to do. You're going to still need to use a lot of clinical judgment with micromedics. But you can be very comfortable with Lexicomp or directly with AHFS drug information, which is tied to Lexicomp, as being those off-label but well-established uses. So the questions you need to ask first, is it reasonable? Is what they're doing for reasonable? Is it in the literature? Is it in either a tertiary reference or a well-accepted reference? Or can I find some things in PubMed? The ones that are the toughest, the ones where you get a physician that has just come back from a national meeting and I saw a poster on this and now I want to try it. But you got to ask, is it investigational or not? Is IRB approval required before we do it? We actually had some surgical residents here that were really very excited about this trial that was published in the literature last year that said it was a magic cocktail for septic patients if you gave them high-dose vitamin C and thiamine. And guess what? The high doses of ascorbic acid that they were using, they cost us $70 a vial. So they were like, oh, we're just going to do it in a bunch of patients, and then we're going to see. We're going to collect. Well, guess what? No, no. Very expensive. We can't afford it, and there are confirmatory trials being done. But that individual trial that was published was done with IRB oversight, and it was published, but it hasn't been confirmed yet. And there is actually a multi-site study going on now to see if it can be confirmed, because the study that was done was open label and it was really more just descriptive. And you can describe a whole bunch of marvelous things when it's open label and not well controlled, right? So investigational or not, IRB approval required or not. If it's investigational, with the very rare exceptions, IRB approval is going to be required. And I think I've given you on your handouts some few examples when not, and we'll talk about a couple of them next session on Thursday. But if it's investigational, there's a whole bunch of different regulations and requirements that kick into place. And again, this is a whole lot easier to consider if it's a drug that's not on the market, and the only way you can get it through is investigational channels. But if it's a drug on the market, this is a question you might need to ask. So when you get the order or you get the prescription, the questions you're asking, is this in a patient population that's either in the labeling or in the literature, in my references, as reasonable? Is the dosing reasonable? Is the route reasonable? Does this all make sense as far as being in good clinical judgment? The other big stickler that will help you differentiate whether it's an unlabeled use of an approved drug or investigational and requires all these additional steps in IRB approval is when data is being collected. So it becomes research automatically once you start collecting data, prospectively collecting data. And then the question is it an observational study that because the drug's on the market, and you're just doing comparative effectiveness, that it doesn't require IRB approval? Well, you better have that assurance in writing up front. But if you're prospectively assigning someone to this drug or that drug, or this drug or placebo, or even doing a whole series of patients this way that's outside of the labeling, and you're collecting data on it, you're going to be better off erring and saying, yes, that's investigation, unless you have some documentation otherwise. So those are just some good flags and things for you to think about as you're screening orders, talking to other clinicians or patients. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the requirement for informed consent. So if it's investigational, you're going to need informed consent. There is only one very, very narrow exception to that, and that is for emergency research when certain conditions are met and documented, and there's very specific criteria where that's the case. The other thing I want to highlight, though, is there's a difference between the informed consent process and informed consent document. So you hear slang often used, they signed an informed consent. So they signed a piece of paper. You can sign a piece of paper and not truly understand what you're getting into. So the piece of paper is the written documentation of the informed consent process. And IRB and the FDA regulations require both written informed consent and that informed consent process. The other thing that's good to know that when is informed consent required? So federally regulated or federally funded. So if it's going to be used to submit to the FDA, or if it's funded by any federal agency, then informed consent is required. But again, publication is desired, or you want to present it at a professional meeting, you're going to need to get informed consent. Unless it's a retrospective observational study for something that is standard of care. So I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail, but I've listed for you all the elements of informed consent. These are the elements that need to be discussed with the potential participant, as well as documented in the written informed consent form. That the trial's research, that it's an experiment, the purpose, the treatments, the responsibilities of the participant, risks and expected benefits. Alternatives to participation if there are any. If it's something that's more than minimal risk, are they going to be compensated for any injury? So they need to know what happens if they get injured because they're in the study. They could have a hospital bill. They could end up in an ICU or an ER. Is that going to be on their own, out of their own pocket, or is the study going to pay for that? Confidentiality, how their information is going to be protected. Their privacy, who to contact for questions. And it's very important that they realize and understand and have the assurance that research is voluntary, that they can refuse to participate and they can stop. This is a really important part of the process in the discussion in the case where the researcher is also a physician who's taking care of that patient. So there's a lot more potential for confusion and a need for a lot more discussion in the cases where it's there's a patient-physician relationship for clinical care, and then that same individual is a study investigator, and they're going to the patient and trying to convince them to be in a clinical trial. Because that research investigator has different motives from that same individual as the treating physician. So that element is really, really important part of the discussion. Pharmacist involvement is going to be a lot more of what I'm going to talk about on Thursday. We're involved in trial design, setup, packaging, watching out for drug information, drug interaction, randomization and blinding. There may be pharmacists involved in the level of the sponsor or a contract research organization, different companies that are helping conduct the research, or in the clinical trial site itself. Pharmacist involvement, as I mentioned, is an IRB for review and approval of the protocol. We also have pharmacist involvement here in a scientific review committee for our cancer center, for example. So there's pharmacist involvement in the process of the science review. Hospital-specific procedures were an important part of that, and the Georgia law requires that the pharmacy director is personally responsible for having the right procedures in place. Drug information obviously is key, which is why this is part of the drug information class. ADR monitoring for patients that are on trial and making sure that reporting happens, even if we as the pharmacists are not always the ones that do the direct reports. And then quality assurance and compliance. So we as the pharmacists involved are there as an advocates for the patient as well as for the conduct of the trial. And we want to make sure that we're participating, that we're looking out for that patient and protecting them and their rights and welfare. Drug information needs, in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to show you some of the safety and safeguards that we have in place. A big part of that is the investigational drug information we put together. So individuals that are taking care of patients on study don't have access to the whole drug brochure and the clinical trial protocol. That is limited to the individuals that are part of the study team. But very often there are other healthcare professionals, whether it's out in community offices, an ER, the hospital setting, that need the drug information to adequately take care of the patient. So we prepared drug data sheets or IDVS, investigational drug information sheets, that have that drug information targeting the healthcare professional taking care of the patient. We're also involved with safeguards to make sure that IRB approval has been obtained, consent has been obtained, that the investigator, the individual that's ordering the study drug is an investigator on the trial, and that all the study protocol procedures are being followed. That might include blinding, that might include a special method of administration. We are involved sometimes in information for patients as well. So we had a local clinical trial that had patients having to take home and self-administer an intramuscular injection. So for that one, because it was locally designed, they hadn't thought about the step that, you know, most patients aren't able to do that, just walk home and do that with the vial handed to them. So we really jumped in and said, as pharmacists, we want to make sure you have written information to go with some nurse education before that patient goes home and does administration or has a family member administer an IM injection at home. We don't do as much with patient information because the primary source of drug information for the patient is actually the informed consent document. Because that informed consent document has the risks, has the benefits, has the side effects, has how to take it. So the patient information is going to be detailed for the patient or participant in the informed consent. Here's a case, a real case that came up, and you can see it's a very old one. Patient submitted with study drug, actually, in Athens General, elective surgery. I got a call. The drug was rasagiline, 1 milligram PO daily, patient-owned supply. At this point, rasagiline was an investigational drug, and the pharmacist couldn't find anything about it other than looking at facts and comparisons and saying it was an investigational drug and it was for Parkinson's disease. So they didn't have any access to any drug information other than they knew the name of the drug and they knew the indication, and they knew the patient had their own supply. So they took a look at the medication labeling, and it had prescription labeling from our pharmacy in it, so they called me. This is what you need to do and I need to do in the same circumstances. It's not one of our drugs. So the pharmacist in Athens called us up and said, I need drug information. We've got a patient having elective surgery tomorrow. So I was able to send them our drug information, the investigational drug data sheet. And here's the information sheet. And it says very clearly it's compared to placebo, it has contraindications, it has therapeutic effects, it has expected side effects, when to take it, how to store it, contact information for the investigators as well as for me as a pharmacist, and a very brief information statement about the study. It says, do not make any drug dose changes or add drug therapy without consulting the investigators. And a really important part with this study was that the drug was a monoamine oxidase B inhibitor. And so it was really important for me to highlight for them to make sure the patient didn't get meperidine for shivering after surgery. So that's an example of how that information could be used. And your homework assignment is going to give you a chance to be in that situation and be in the pharmacist, ask the question. So your information sheet can no more than 1 page. Fill it in. You can write as small as you want. You can type it and send it in electronically or scan it. Either one works. You got to answer every one of those questions to get the full 10 points, pass, fail. I want you to tell me where you found the information. Standard drug information. Look in Lexicon. Look in facts and comparisons. Look on the web. Look at clinicaltrials.gov. Can you find out information like what phase of study, what the drug mechanism is, what the indication is, what the dose is, the side effects, if it's investigational or not, if it's an orphan drug or not? How good are the resources, those different resources, in giving you the information that you might need to interact with the physician, interaction with the nurse, interact with the patient? And bring it to class, and we'll be talking about those and other examples on Thursday. And here's a quick example for you. I have to change the homework assignment every year because the drugs that I work with keep getting on the market, or the ones that were really challenging aren't as challenging anymore. But pomalidomide is an outpatient drug for sickle cell. It was FDA approved as Pomalyst, but for multiple myeloma. As part of the REMS program, access is restricted, so they can only get it under the REMS for multiple myeloma. So if you look up on clinicaltrials.gov, there was a clinical trials in sickle cell, but it's been completed. This is the only clinical trial that was done. So this patient can't get the drug as part of a clinical trial. And actually what was happening in this case was a patient that had a single patient treatment IND because they had been a participant in the clinical trial and got benefit from it. So you really need to be a detective to figure out what the circumstances are in the individual case. And I look forward to seeing what you can find out. Thank you very much. Please make note of my email. It's mphillip@augusta.edu. Even though my name is Phillips, there's no S on my email, just so that the email gets to the right place. I will try and remember to set up an automated reply so it'll tell you I got your email, but it will go right into my box because otherwise my inbox gets exploded. And I will see you on Thursday.